All right, welcome to class number 4. So, basically, we're going to cover is the walk and run cycle stuff. Okay. All right. First off, I generally, and I think some other animators do this as well. I'm sure. I usually break down character movements really into two kind of main categories. One I call locomotion, and the other one on iconography. So basically, the idea is that locomotion is just a continual action, continual movement, that generally represent like physical things, like running, fighting, walking, just a continual motion where there are no like real holds. That it's just a consistent, constant movement. Okay. So I call that locomotion. And generally, obviously, when you think of locomotion, it just means like moving from, movement in a way, right? So like a locomotive is a train. That's the idea. Iconography basically is more, which is funny because I wrote dancing down for locomotion, is more when you're trying to represent a series of symbols or poses or icons to represent what you're trying to do. So typically things that are like acting, talking, emotion, things of that sort. Because usually what you do is you go from one pose, and you try to, and generally this is the way it works. The character is saying something or doing something, usually saying, and what you do is like with the poses, you display basically what they're internally thinking as they're externally saying. All right, the internal motive. You're trying to show what's on the inside through the pose, how they're feeling. Right, if I see someone with their shoulders down and their head down, you think they're sad, right? If you see someone that's kind of got their arms wide open and their head up, you might think that they're more happy. So depending on what you're doing, you're representing different things. The reason it's kind of funny is that dancing really, to a large extent, is kind of a combination, I would say, of locomotion and iconography, because a lot of times when you're doing dancing, it's you're trying to display, at least modern dance, I should say. Not even just modern, but modern is a good example. They're doing a series of poses where they're stretching their arms out and they're trying to represent like love and then hate and anger and whatever, and this whole slew of things, and they kind of go from pose to pose. But it's a kind of continual action, so it's a good kind of mixture of the two. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of basically cover, for the realistic human section here, we're going to be doing basically a walk and run cycle, and then just an action cycle. And both of those are locomotions, okay? So last time I think I spoke about, or not last time, the time before last, I spoke about the straight ahead animation technique. In this case, I'm gonna talk about the layering animation technique. And so basically the idea is there are different versions of it, but the idea is that I'll just scroll down here. So there's straight ahead, pose to pose, and layering. So layering, what it is, and this is particularly valuable when you're doing walk cycles, is that you start off with a rig, has nothing, and then what you do is you might animate one element of it, right? So in this case, I'm just animating the legs. Then what you might do is animate like another section. So in this case, I'm animating the core. Then in the third, I might animate the arms, and then I put them all together, okay? So basically the idea is that you animate one chunk at a time in order to complete an animation, okay? So you just kind of fine tune in each individual section. And so walk cycles generally work pretty well with that. Walk and run cycles and things. So as you can see here, okay. So walk cycle. Generally, this is obviously the main way that, at least for humans, well, not even just humans, other animals as well, but the walk cycle we're going to be doing, a bipedal walk cycle, it's our main way of moving, okay? Now, a lot can be displayed by a walk cycle. I'm merely looking for you guys to do, now if you want to do some sort of interesting walk cycle, I have no problem with that. I'm mostly just looking for you guys to do a generic walk cycle, okay? But depending on what you do in that walk cycle can say a lot about the character itself, okay? So for instance, if they're dragging the feet and they're real low to the ground, you would assume that they are sad. It's negative. But if there's a lot of pop up, if there's a lot of up and down movement on the head, you're going to assume that they're more happy, okay? If you want to do like a male walk, typically the feet will be farther apart, okay? As if it's a female walk, which the legs will be more in line with each other as they'll step over each other. Think of like a boardwalk, like models walking. The reason why is that women's hips are generally wider, so it forces their femurs inwards, so their gait tends to have closer, their feet tend to be closer as opposed to males, which are somewhat the opposite. We're also less flexible. It also causes the up and down motion in general to be less because the feet are over top of each other, so it's not as much up and down, while males will generally have more up and down. But we can get, I mean, you can get crazy with it. There's a lot of things with that, but a walk can say a lot of things. So here are generally the keys. The first thing you usually want to lay out are the contacts. So basically when the feet touch, so this is the first time the foot would hit the ground. And then so you do your contacts. Then you would do the passing position, which is basically the position when it's in the middle between these two, and basically the leg is bent and coming forward on both sides. Okay, so you cut those in half. Then what you would do is you would do the low and high position. So this is when the character is at the lowest point and the character is at the highest point, meaning that this is like when it comes down. It's regaining from just basically falling forward. It's regaining, and then it comes up, and then it just before it goes to fall down again, it has its high position. Okay, and that's basically a walk cycle. And you can kind of see what it looks like here. Okay, and you can kind of see it here. So the process you're going to do is you start with the legs. At least that's how I do it. I mean, everyone can do it kind of differently. I usually like to start with the legs, animate them, go through the whole general thing, then animate the core. So and usually, honestly, I'll kind of animate the core a little bit while I'm doing the legs because it's sort of necessary, which means the spine and what have you. And then lastly, the arms. Arms are done lastly because basically they get affected by what else is happening everywhere else because they're the top of the hierarchy. Mostly the motion is being centered from here, right? The legs are driving the action in this case because the motion's moving its way up. And so the last thing that gets affected is basically the head and the arms. So here's some walking tutorials that you can watch. Now, a run cycle. Run cycle is very similar to a walk cycle, but it is somewhat different. And it also has a formula of its own. I honestly personally find it kind of difficult just because I don't usually do too many of these. Walk cycle I can do in my sleep. I've done so many of those. You use them all the time. Now the run cycle here instead can be a little bit more difficult to do. In some ways it's easier because it's fewer keys, but you actually basically have to animate on every single frame as opposed to a walk cycle, which you can have like every other frame you would animate. And it's very similar. I mean, obviously, you got the arm swinging opposite of the legs and so on and so forth, but it's not the same thing. And I would say generally too, it doesn't say as much about the character as maybe a walk cycle does because there's not as much nuance. It's not as visible. Obviously you can say things, but it just isn't going to be exactly the same. So yeah, this is basically the process. I was posing the entire body on each frame. Instead of like trying to do it from a layered method, I'd actually probably just do more pose to pose. And then I would pose the passing position, then the up and down positions, and then make adjustments. Generally, I find when I'm doing the run cycle, I actually have to make quite a few adjustments because if you look, you can see the up and down is quite a bit more. The legs are also more widespread. So that's going to mean that things are more extended, which can mean that when you're animating, there's more of a likeliness that something's going to get twisted or inverted or, it's more likely to have issues when you're doing the run cycle. It's also off the ground. There's a lot of things. Okay. So here's a run cycle tutorial. So basically, so that's that. So for your next assignment, what I want you to do is animate a walk and run cycle using the human you rigged from the previous week. Okay, so just do both. All right, and you can just follow these tutorials. It's actually relatively simple. If you want to use a different tutorial, I have no problem with that either. There should just be a walk and a run, and you can do any one you want. I would say generally I would just do a generic one because it's your first one. And we will do these in class as well. But these are one of those things, especially if you want to be an animator, you just have to kind of commit to memory and then start to play around with these. And, in the future, when you're looking, when you're walking around or you're like eating dinner or lunch or something at like a restaurant, I watch people walk. I know it sounds weird, but it's interesting. Some people have some really strange gaits. And you can tell a lot from people just by the way that they move around. All right. That's it.